Today I have the distinct pleasure to introduce to you two extraordinary sustainability experts. One is Jeff Kavanaugh, whom I've known for quite some time now. We met at the UN a couple of years ago. He is adjunct professor at the Jindal School of Management at the University of Texas at Dallas, and vice president and head of the Infosys Knowledge Institute, the research and thought leadership arm of Infosys. And the other guest of mine is Corey Glickman, vice president at Infosys, faculty expert at Singularity University, member of the MIT Technology Review Board, as well as pioneering the World Economic Forum for Global Cities. Thank you both for being on the program, and welcome to the Investment Turnaround.
Glad to be here, thanks.
Very happy to be here also, Mariana.
Well, the two of you co-authored a very new book that is entitled Practical Sustainability, Circular Commerce, Smarter Spaces, and Happier Humans. Why did you write the book, and what are the top tenets of it?
Well, Jeff, why don't I take this one to start out with?
Please.
So it's very interesting to get a chance to write a book and the different motivations from it. But to be very direct, as I started to look at the role of having to provide sustainability solutions as part of my mandate in my role, as I was looking at strategies of how we would do this, it became very apparent that as I got deeper thinking about sustainability, I realized that a book wasn't an option. It was a must. It was a way to not just to coalesce ideas, but it was part of a design process as we think about designing systems. It says, how do you take information? How do you not only process it so that it can be used, whether it's by businesses or students or the next generation of sustainability thinkers and movers and shakers? It was also a way of how do you contribute to the bigger need? So the idea of the book really germinated that it started out to saying, well, we needed something in order to be able to create the frameworks to share ideas, but it became something much more as we started to create this. And it was saying that this had to be part of the path and the journey in order to go above and beyond just business, go above and beyond, say, just personal achievement, but to actually contribute to a solution that is needed. That is my motivation. I don't know, Jeff, your thoughts?
Comes down to that triad of logos, pathos, and ethos. The science is there for us now. The heart, the moral compass, I think, as we see some of these opportunities in the environment, socially, governance, inequality, and things like that. And then also just the practicality, the viability of it, because just to feel good about something or to be passionate about something isn't enough to make it so. And after being with the company for over a decade, almost 17 years now, and seeing the progress we made in certain areas, especially beyond the US, where I'm from, places like India and other places, to see what's possible and to have a moment where, along with Corey, who leads the unit, and myself and my role, to be in a position of influence, we said, we had to do this. And then it became a journey to see how can we get the research and convert it, almost through a crucible, to actually share with others so they can actually make the changes themselves. So the fact that the head and the heart and the science are behind it, I think that's really the impetus for all this.
So what are the top tenets? Because obviously this is an extraordinary undertaking that I mean, you have a certain focus, which is extremely important that we will get to, but can you give our audience the top tenets of the book if they sell the book for us, please?
Well, Corey, if you don't mind, I'll just give the 30 seconds and you can dive
certainly
in. This is a wicked challenge, sustainability, let's just say broadly speaking, and for business and for society. And so rather than trying to tackle the hardest parts first, much of what we need today and the bigger chunks we can already accomplish. So we talked about smarter spaces, all the technology, all that integration of complex systems. That's a fundamental part. Over 40% of greenhouse gas emissions, for example, come from the construction and operation of buildings. So smart spaces and these digital systems are important. Number two, the circular supply chains, this idea of not being so wasteful. That's also something that's very prominent in business. So those areas are, I wouldn't call them low-hanging fruit as much as they're right there in front of us. We know how to do it. We have the technology, and we have some of the underpinnings in place that go beyond efficiency. So digital twins that marry the physical and the digital, the idea that there are applied systems design, these are complex challenges. And then lastly, that the human needs to stay at the center of all this as to why. So the experience people get, both for their safety as well as their fulfillment, those are important. Over to you, Corey.
I think that it's very well stated. I think what I would like to add to this is, why do we call it practical sustainability? And there's really two tenets to that. The first being, we believe, and I think there's definitive proof that not only does society understand the mandate and the longevity of what this need is, so we know that the need is going to be there. And even if we don't know all of the technologies at this point, we know many of the technologies that can directly impact across there. And we also know that culturally, they will be accepted. So whether that happens at a government level or that happens at a business level or at an individual level, we know the momentum will stay there. Secondly, why we call it practical sustainability is much of what we're talking about has deep roots in science, and you have to have empirical proof in order for technology to work and to have real quantitative measurements take place. However, the ability to create frameworks and formulas that can be more widely dispersed by many, right? They may not have to have the complete deep science knowledge, but if they can have access to formulas or to patterns or to frameworks, you suddenly open up the world to invention, to innovation, and to investment. And you will find individuals that are deeply scientific or deeply educated or deeply established in their given professions across there being very effective in sustainability. But you will also find, younger advocates or individuals that might be very good at what they're currently doing, be it in technology or be it in finance or being it in government and policy, that maybe don't have that deep science knowledge. But if we give them the tools, they can be very, very effective and bring that side of this also to here. So, as we like to say here, when we look at emphasis, and we're very fortunate to be in a journey where we've been negative net neutral carbon for 2 years now. It was a 10-year journey for us that we started in 2008, where we planned it. We actually started to activate it in 2010. And by 2020, we have been able to reduce the carbon and do all the right metrics across here. I always say that if we could do this in 10 years based off the technologies that we had to work with then and what we have with now, companies that are setting dates for 2040, 2050 out there, we'd like to challenge them. We believe that if we could do it in 10 years, what we know today, why can't you do it in 7 years or in 10 years like we did? So we're trying to make these practical aspects. The last point that I'll say on this, reinforcing what Jeff was saying, we chose specific areas because it's a very broad area. But if you can look at the built environment, if you can look at commerce, circular commerce, and if you can look at the human element components, you can solve that first 50% relatively quickly with a good return on investment. It's that next 20% or 30% that is a bit more difficult to go through and that'll take longer. And it's that last 20%, which will just be an ongoing approach. So really the goal of tenants is to say, how do we get to that first 50% and get our way onto the next 30% very, very quickly?
Right. So I couldn't agree more with you when it comes to the importance of scientific research to back up the claims that everyone is trying to make these days, particularly now that most people have understood the importance of what we call circular economy, to which we will get. How did you conduct this research, and how did you identify the areas that are most important that we should be focusing on, I should say, within the next 10 years, due to the fact that scientists tell us that we only have 10 years to switch our systems toward more sustainable ones that would enable humanity to thrive on the planet. In other words, going back to the planetary boundaries that we have left.
Corey, why don't I take the emphasis perspective?
Absolutely.
And you take the external. Okay. Starting in 2006, my first trip to the parts of emphasis, and was fortunate to start working with and interacting with the people who are doing this. 50 million square feet under climate control is a pretty damn large laboratory. And fortunately, like Corey said, even as far back as 2008, 2009, started to instrument and measure. Of course, not quite where we are today, but just keep measuring. In fact, in some cases, we put up two buildings, one the old way and one the most advanced energy efficient way. There'd be social programs. Instead of purchasing offsets, for example, working with biogas or some kind of social nonprofit to help others. And I highlight that because it's all been data driven. As a tech company with a consulting arm and then with a penchant towards delivering on time, on budget, transferred those types of disciplines to the built world, to construction, to commerce, and even social programs. And the fortunate thing about collecting data is it allows you to derive insights. Isn't just hypothesis or isn't just anecdotes. Plenty of anecdotes along the way, but there's enough there to have trends. So we had a big enough petri dish or big enough repository and laboratory ourselves over a longitudinal, a long enough time that we were able to be conclusive. And also, we were fortunate to have about $1 billion unit, 15,000, I call knuckle-dragging engineers, doing hardcore engineering and software and mechanical, electromechanical. So we were able to actually look at the engineering side of it. We were able to do that ourselves. And it wasn't just some second or third party data. So as a result of that, for several aspects of sustainability, supply chain, product development, design, green design, packaging, as well as the whole built environment, smart buildings and the effects of that, we're able to actually have our own primary research. And then we coupled that, turn it over to you, Corey, with an external view as well.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. We start looking at the external view, and I think that there's sources that we know that are more industry standards that generally either result in indexes or such as what the WEF would put out, or perhaps what the UN and many of the standards come across there. But there's also specialty indexes that we see are unique. So, for instance, one of the programs that we're involved in is with MIT, and what's called the Blue Tech Index that we've created, which is really the largest true index on looking at oceanographic economics and the impact of biodiversity. And this has become very relevant over the last year, especially with supply chain and how much commerce goes on the ocean. So there's this constant set of indexes that are standard, and then there are these newer ones that are being identified as we as a world economy recognize what we have to know more data about, because if we don't have data, we can't have measurements, and if we don't have measurements, it's very, very hard to prove anything, both quantitatively and even qualitatively across there. And then there's another source, many organizations that have done some wonderful work, whether they're at the community level or some of the tier one major players have made significant investments in both, say, geospatial technologies or understanding, how their supply chains work. They've done a good job of documenting how this goes. We found that these players are very open with sharing of how they're doing things and understanding how these data constructs are working through there. I think one of the big challenges with this all, though, is starting out to recognize what are the standards, right? We try to belong to as many organizations that are widely recognized, such as the UN, such as the WEF, some as these major academic institutions and government entities, because we feel that the standards have to work at a global level and that we have to be able to have metrics that we recognize globally across here. So getting access, I think people are still trying to find out how they can commercialize it. And sometimes you have to make decisions on where you go across there. But majority, like when we did the book, we have over 340 sources, that we were able to work with in order to support our narratives and the messaging and the frameworks that we've come across there. And those partners gave us complete access, right, very freely, because I think there is that higher mandate that says we have to get this right. We have to make this information available across there. Of course, the big challenge is, like any other data set, it's a big data problem. And how do you sort through that data, and how do you find what is relevant? And this is where I know, Mariana, yourself as an expert in artificial intelligence, this is where tools like AI and machine learning and future things to come really help. And when we talk about digital twins, often this is how we think about it, right? Digital twins are that expression of how can we understand data and anomalies in ways that we can comprehend and share.
Yeah, so what makes the book, Practical Sustainability, distinct from what is typically covered by academia or the press? And so, and how, what are the three most important things that people would find in the book that they wouldn't find anywhere else?
Go ahead, Corey, and I'll compliment.
Okay, so I think that what people will find in the book, what makes it special is a couple of areas, or what makes it unique. First of all, it is very specifically targeted to be able to deliver key frameworks, once again, that are very doable and achievable across a wide group of potential users. It is really focused for businesses. It is focused for that next generation. It's got a key target in academia. There's been a high interest across there. We also know that it's a cultural change agent, that this is a way of taking almost any individual who will be able to read and understand this. And we made a conscious decision when we wrote this book that would it be something with deep research and like a heavy manual equivalent to Julia Child's Art of French Cooking, or would it be something that can be more about narratives and links to areas? And we felt that at this stage of evolution of where companies are and where we were in our own journey, it was better to go with known capabilities and things that worked. And what we've heard from over 30 experts in many companies that we've worked with, to say these are tactical, practical things that will take place, and to share those frameworks. The deeper research part, there are links to that, and we see this, there'll be a continuation, but we tried not to put that all inside this book, because it would have been a 3 or 4 year project, I think, to do that properly. So the real idea of this book was to say, if I had to understand what sustainability means, if I had to understand, what those terms are, if I would want to understand the important concepts around, ESG and finance, or understanding how important is the built environment, or how important is a circular economy, I could get those concepts. And then there's also some deeper areas that we went into. We've focused also in areas such as systems design as a way of logically thinking through a problem, and how would that work. We talked about how do you see value and realization And we have a very heavy specific focus on the built environment, just because it has such an impact through here. And we do have a chapter on implementation. So we just didn't want it to be, good things to do or how to think about it, but actually, if tomorrow you said, I need to get started, where's those areas? What are some toolkits that I can use, and what are the links, and what are the case studies coming across there? Going to the second part of your question of saying, the three specific, areas, it's right in the title. When we started to look at this whole idea of sustainability, we had to make some decisions around the frameworks. And we very specifically focused, first of all, on this whole idea of the built environment and smarter spaces. We spend just under 90% of our time in buildings. And we will continue to do so. And I think cities and buildings have always represented, where we work and where we live. And they are, as Jeff said earlier, they account for 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions from both the built and the operations across there. So doing your buildings is not just important, but it's also very feasible, because buildings have this unique situation where they're very measurable, right? You can't build things without codes. The regulations are already there. They have to be constructed in certain ways. But buildings have always been, up to now, a laggard in compared to other sprints of technology. So if we think, the amount of intelligence in, say, a smartphone compared to what's in a building, there's more in a smartphone. So the ceiling is unlimited. Sorry for the pun about buildings, about this should be the world's largest network of connected things. When we talk about 50 billion connected objects, this is what we're talking about that happens across here. So we all use buildings. So buildings is a very tactical area for us. The second is around the circular commerce area. We have to have good commerce. We have to have new models come out there. We have to have supply chains that work through here. So being able to understand supply chains that use less waste, that have loop systems that allow for reuse of materials, that start to use data even more effectively in a more responsible way. It's another area that, because it is how businesses will be run, we know that there will be adoption, and therefore through that adoption, there'll be more sustainability coming across here. And then the third part, as you talked about, is the human element. I think it's become very obvious to us, especially with what's happened with COVID over the last couple of years, that no matter how much technology that we have and how we might measure our economies, we're still part of a biology and of an ecosystem. And we have to respect that. And ultimately, how we choose to use our lives, and how we tend to make our decisions. If the human element is not going to move along with this, then none of it is going to succeed for us.
Jeff, would you like to add to that, or shall I
Yeah.
go to the next question?
Real quick, another dimension. Who would use this? Imagine if a leader, could be a CEO, could be their executive, commissioned a study on how sustainability will work in their company. This hopefully will be a tremendous jolt and jumpstart. This was written for a leader to get something done. Number two, for someone, let's say, in the trenches, what can they do? How can they make sense of it? And then finally, there is a practical sense that for a financial person to say, yeah, this sounds really good, but I don't want to do it at the expense of next quarter or the next 6 months or economic power. We're showing them you don't have to choose one or the other. There's a duality here. And we took the essence so that those common elements can be done now. Otherwise, you could say you're quote unquote right, but still be in the same place 2 years later while you argue about why we haven't gotten started. So those three aspects, that's why the word practical is the first word in the title.
Brilliant. So let's go to dig deeper into, you talked about the circular economy and sustainability in general. So can you please give me or us a definition of both, of what does sustainability mean to you? within the context of the book. What is sustainability in your definition? And the other is, how do you define circular economy, given the fact that less than 6% of the material input are indeed recyclable, which of course means a lot from the perspective of construction, of the construction business.
So Jeff, why don't I start with this one, and then if you could add your thoughts to this. So first, let's take the question is, what does sustainability mean? And for us, it is the E, the environment, the social, and the governance, and we look at all three of those aspects through here. And once again, it's a system, right? Because they all have their own dynamics, and it's at a high level. When we talk about practicality, when we think about the environment, one of the first areas that we can look at is saying the assets themselves. How can they either be produced in a less carbon-free, way, and also produce less carbon is really important through here. So in their operations in life, how do those physical assets are able to have less of a carbon footprint or move towards more of a carbon neutral and then to a net carbon zero if possible through technology. This also goes with digital assets, right? So as we know, much of the world, runs off of the software along with the physical aspects. And for us, this is around what I call sustainable transformation. So we all have digital transformations that we've been working on for 5 or 6 years now. But now the sustainability agenda is around how do we use these systems of record and data and do our digital aspects in a sustainable fashion, whether that's green IT or whether that's understanding, both the growth of servers and cloud and the impact that has on greenhouse gases, and how do we start using technologies to rethink, what does that mean across there? In summary, with the digital and with the physical assets, it is really about how do we take quantitative measurements as much as possible and being able to act across those. And when we start looking at the social aspects and sustainability, whether that is the aspects of workplace rights or health and safety, quality and justice, those tend to be more qualitative in fashion. And they're part of that solution of human element. And we look to move this into a quantitative state also through putting this into systems of records and into systems of measurement. And then there's the whole governance aspect. We do a lot of work with several governments, not just with India, but with some of the Nordic countries in particular right now, where we're helping saying, how do we take an entire country down to both a carbon neutral status within a certain time frame, and also how to build their economy. So we're dealing with the regulatory issues, and we're understanding, how does decarbonization take place, or how does societal cultural change take place. And these become part of these systems that we need to design, which is why we use systems thinking. Before I go into the circular economy, Jeff, did you want to add anything to that thought process?
There's a textbook definition, but in reality, it's a page from what you say quite often, Mariana, about implementing SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, within planetary boundaries, that there are individual goals that taken together, you've got to work within this feasible area, this emotional desirability, technical feasibility, and economic viability, because if you violate any of those and go too far off, no one's going to do it, or it can't be done. And so for us, yes, there's an efficiency, replenishment, and regenerative, all those good adjectives. In the end, take what we can do now, because even the 6%, I might push back a little bit if we add some other forms of capital in there, because with humans, for example, reskilling and upskilling and viewing humans as an asset, I don't mean it in a bad way, in a very positive, organic way. A lot is possible, because when people can renew their skills, provide for their families, be responsible citizens, have more equality, more contribution to society, a lot of the other things that get in the way start to recede. For example, I remember one quote whenever we were together at the UN, International Day of Women and Girls in Science, and that research that was showing that more educated women, especially in developing countries, meant they wouldn't stand for some of these governments or, more authoritarian regimes. So that's one example of a regenerative answer from ESG standpoint coming from investing in the human sustainability aspect. So I know it's a little more of a stretch than the hardcore assets we're talking about, like supply chains and that kind of commerce. But I do think we can bend the arc, and we'll get to the more on the finance type aspects in a moment. Go ahead.
So if we go into the idea of the circular economy components, so we're members of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation for 2 years now, and work quite closely with them. And it's really interesting to see the trends that they're able to communicate across there. And I think that we've seen a market difference in, say, tier one players, the very large companies like the Unilevers and so forth, that have made really important investments and strides, to lead the way, to say, this is what can be done. These are things that we're able to take across everything, once again, from like geospatial data to understand emissions down to how does that supply chain work and how do we, really rethink across there. And then there's the aspect, though, that we all face, that when you get to tier 2 and tier 3 players, because this is also, they may not have the resources and they may not have the technology at this point that will economically allow them to survive, of what's going on, especially what's happened with COVID as business has been challenged through here. So it all has to take place. But the challenge is that when you get to that circular supply chain component, I think the definitions of saying, or the concepts that says, if I put less waste in, right, I can get less waste out. If I can have more, complete loops that understands from not just a idea that it's about production and consumption and then price and schedule, but also from the very idea that when I start something, I'm going to think, how is it going to be reused? And how do I perhaps make some trade-offs, because there's benefits, whether it's triple bottom line or whether it's single bottom line sustainability that says that I can be profitable and I can create an economy and I can bring all those other aspects, to society by creating these circular economy loops. I think we understand those concepts. I think the technologies are there, but it's like moving a large, ocean liner. They're saying, it's moving down there, and there's not just a matter of re-engineering or rethinking your whole supply chains in a very challenging time right now, but you have to economically survive it at this point. And you have to say, if I'm going to do this, how do I get those tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers to be able to also participate? I think at the first level, they can do it through information sharing. But we also know that with privacy of data and that there's so many disparate systems out there, there's a lot of work that has to be done, but it's a solvable thing to come across here. I think that there's also there's a large difference of what kind of organization or company or business that you have. Say a company that is like ourselves, which is very digital based, and many banks are like this also. It's easier to do digital assets and make these, closed loop things. But if you're a large materialistic company that has, many aspects of carbon and products and chemicals across there, they're never going to be carbon free. It's just technically impossible. And it is a lot harder challenge for them to make these circular economy aspects take place. But they're the ones that are ultimately going to make this work. And this is where a lot of the innovation is going to take place. But where people can start on this is if they think of their product design from the beginning, from day one, saying, how can I track carbon? How can I look at the energy that I'm putting in here? What happens to my product along the way? Can I make it last longer so it doesn't have to go, be rebuilt into the system? Can I look at servitude more and move my model, not just from physical product and transaction, but to actually have services that elongate and change the model that says the value is now not just the physical product itself, but it's actually the value and the attributes that it delivers to you as a service. It will start to impact how people think about what their supply chain needs to be, and it will start to streamline what actually has to take place in a supply chain. Jeff,
wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Corey and Jeff, for explaining that. The reason why I brought up circular economy is because I take issue with the name, because we don't live in a circular world. We evolve. Everything evolves. So I think that that's why I have adopted the integral consciousness model, because
yes.
A circular economy should be replaced with a spiral evolutionary economy.
It's iterative. You're correct.
So that's why I think I think it's just like, I don't want to be called a consumer. I mean, if we want to shift to a sustainable economy, or whatever name we give it to it, integral economy, I don't care, then we need to be careful with the names that we're using, with the language that we're using, right, because it has a huge impact onto everything that we do and how we show up in the world. And so with that, I would like to get back to Corey's third, and what I think is one of the most important points with respect to the adoption of such progressive and evolutionary models like yours. And I'm thinking of the cultural agent aspect, the mind shift. So maybe you would like to tell me something about go into more detail, and maybe along with that use some sort of metrics that would help the cultural change agents know us, that we're actually making progress, and how do we know that? And then I'd like to continue with regulations and what it means from a perspective of an investor to subscribe and adopt and adapt, SFDR being one of the European challenges that we have right now with respect to the taxonomy and others. So please, if you could say something with respect to the culture agents and the mind shift aspect in your book.
Go ahead, Corey.
Oh, absolutely. So, one of I think the fourth chapter of the book, if I remember right, is that we talk about the human element, and we brought that up very, very, very quickly. This idea of understanding that we've known for a while in many of our aspects of technology, or how we think about this even prior to a focus on sustainability, that technology was always trying to look at saying, how will humans adopt, right, these things? As Jeff was saying before, if something doesn't have a viability from a business perspective, if it doesn't have a feasibility from a technology perspective, it's not going to work. But also, if it's not going to be adopted, if humans are not going to pick this up, then it's not going to work, right? So I think we've all been trained as consultants, or as technologists, or as business leaders, regardless of where you're from, to really start looking at the human component of this through here. And with sustainability in particular, because it has such a huge impact on our very health and well-being, and how we are going to be living in our cities and in our other areas. Through here, the human element has a huge, huge impact, not just as the outcome, but also as the influencer. People will decide, which services, which businesses, which companies they choose to, go on based off of what the performance or what the brand perception of the services they go with. So having said that, there are lots of tools and frameworks that says this is how we understand how to map how people think about things, how they would like to experience an interaction in within a system here. So I'll give you an example. So if we were to create a service map for, say, healthcare, there could be, say, 3 variants. So within a healthcare system, it could be a hospital experience. It could be an experience in going with a pharmaceutical company, working in a factory. It could be something to do with how do you get your insurance through here, and how that individual is treated, whether they are, in a hospital, and how is that service taking place, and are they getting proper care? There's ways to map to make sure that all the technology and all the processes will work well for them. If you are working in a pharmaceutical company and you're using technologies to come with the next vaccine sets, how do the factories become more automated? How can research be conducted? How can information be shared? How can I comprehend all this? There are things that you'll design in a system in order for humans to not just take advantage of technology, but to be more productive as they come across there. And then if you're, say, in insurance, the whole idea of saying, how do I get the coverage? How do I able to access my benefits? How do I am able to deliver those systems upon the provider, so in a way that is economically feasible, but also will cover the needs of what's happening here. So they all have different parts of human mapping that we need to take place across here. I think humans, more so than ever, have understood, whether it's through the explosion of social media, whether it's been through a higher level of education, whether it's because information just travels so much, they have a much more active voice. And we hear news so quickly across here. And I think COVID has really magnified this, that we understand now that regardless of where you are in the world, you're going to hear about things, and you're going to know that what you do and your decisions that come across are actually going to have impact through areas. So I think people are very empowered at this point. So designing systems, it's kind of an interesting paradox. As we become more technology enabled and more with AI and machine learning and other aspects, things become more automated for us, right? And that's just a natural evolution of technology. But as a society, we're probably being more challenged than ever before to say, what does it mean to be human? And so this idea of having a human voice and having systems that work with us and for us, as opposed to just delivering across there, is really important. So using human factors, understanding concepts that Don Nelson and Norman and Nelson, sorry, I'm getting their names mixed up here, about the design of everyday things that really came about a couple of decades ago. Those principles hold very true for us right now, and we continue to make sure that the human element is at the forefront across here. I guess the last thing that I would like to say, at least this part, and then I'll hand over to you, Jeff, is it's more than just creating the experience, but the sustainability agenda and transformation is a mandated opportunity as we rethink not just our economies, but how we are as a society. And we ourselves, as we look at the workforce issues out there, and how people choose to select their jobs, we've recognized that part of understanding sustainability, especially from the social aspect, is it's no longer a world that says you have to have a certain level of degree, you have to have a doctorate, or you have to have a master's in order to be productive and to be able to solve things. The fact of the matter is that you can have many kinds of level of education that can be very, very productive through here. And that sometimes almost all the time, it's not just a conscious choice that says, why do I only have a 2-year degree versus a 4-year or a 6-year degree? It's not maybe just an economic choice, it's a societal choice. And that you just might not, certain cultures or certain economies, environments would not allow these very important and impactful individuals have the opportunity to not just contribute, but to create new economies in their own communities, if they're given the chance, if their training takes place here. So we have set up programs ourselves through our foundations that really focus on what we would say the underserved through either economic issues or other things, that says with some training, with some exposure, that they can not only be very productive, they can become leaders, and that will then cause a flywheel effect within their own communities and bringing this whole new generation of what it means to be a thought leader. It's very much what you were saying, Marion, about being a spiral. It's not a circular loop. It's not a closed club. It's how do you enable this to take place?
Well, the thing I'll say is one
Jeff,
thing,
please.
Maslow, think Maslow and apply it to the human experience. Sustainability isn't just about feeling good and it's self-actualizing. It's about basic things. Am I safe? Am I healthy? Can I go into this building? Do I have the data? Of course, there's the safety, there's physical safety with a lot of the violence and everything, as well as the health. COVID really brought this to light. One example, we're working with a major developer, a good percentage of downtown Manhattan, for example, in office buildings, and having to think through, how do you open a building up? How do you make sure it's safe? How do you let people get the confidence? So Maslow's hierarchy applies for sustainability just like it does in other parts of life. So go ahead.
So given the fact that we only have 7 years to set our systems up in such a way that we go back to a safe operating system of the planet, how do we accelerate this transformation from a cultural change agent perspective, particularly through big organizations, and given the inertia and the reluctance of people to want to change? Because if it were easy, sustainability has been around ever since Brundtland brought it, put it into the public sphere, and we haven't accomplished much. The opposite is the case. So how do you think that practical sustainability will accelerate this process in an exponential way so that we can reach that goal of addressing the human factor and move fast up the Maslow pyramid?
It's a great question. Go ahead, Jeff. Jeff, you can go first this time.
I was just going to say, although 7 years, 8 years, whatever the number is critical, we also have to start where we are. And if for some reason it took 6 years or 9 years, the fact is we got to do something. And the good news is we took a hard look at that, said, what can people do? And of the 1,000 things you can do, there are 6 chunks. First of all, get specific on sustainability, have a plan. Look at your built environment, do the things you know you can and should do. Use the power of IoT and use all the technologies in your favor. Collect the data, make some sense, and respond and act on it. So sustainability is a plan. Next, and this is important, with all due respect to the triple bottom line, we need a single bottom line of sustainability, because you can't have the sustainability people off in some other room doing good things. It needs to be in the middle of the business and affect the core of your business. So embed it in your plan. You have the plan. Next, you optimize these physical and digital assets. Don't wait, do it now. And because buildings are such a big culprit or such a big factor, even these very material intensive companies can still make a big impact. Because remember, factories are a big contributor for this. Next, address beyond those nodes, those factories across the supply chain. Maybe you localize manufacturing, or you localize consumption. You with solar can contribute energy back to the grid, or all these different aspects across the nodes, the integral supply chain, let's call it. Next, have a specific, sophisticated strategy for carbon offsets. Literally, how are you going to offset, not just by purchasing a bunch of trees or other offsets, but actually doing good outside the company for the scope 2 and 3 emissions. And finally, embed the culture. And this idea of micro changes, work with behavioral psychology. Understand that people respond to nudges like a ratchet, click, 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 and don't go back. Every positive step forward, you move it. You don't have some big bang from 0 to 100. you go through a series of clicks. It could be every 2 weeks, every 6 weeks. By doing that, it's not imperceptible, but it's small enough changes. People aren't asked to make a leap of faith every single time. And yet, in a fairly short period of time, they can make big change. Those are the 6 big steps we've seen and we've tested ourselves. Corey, if you wanted to add.
Yeah, I think it's really well said. There's just a couple of points I'd like to add. So if we take those 6 steps, I think there's the roots to all 4 of these to work. One is around data, right? And we, I think, understand enough about data in technology. Although it's different kinds of data now, it's still a big data problem. And we have ways of looking at data, understanding those measurements going across there. The second has to do with your technology decisions on your physical and your digital sides. The third has to do, how will the finance work? The sustainable financing, because that's going to be the engine that's going to enable these 7 years to come across there. Those mechanisms have to come in place. And then the fourth is the cultural aspect. I think what is going to be key through here is that you will find, and we're seeing this right now when we came out of COP26, there's a large global government regulatory component to this, right? And that has to happen because for large programs of scale, that's how you're able to achieve standards that will be recognized, at a level that will have impact. If you don't solve it for everywhere, it's not going to work through here. But at the same time, you can't take the innovation away from companies or individuals that can move maybe much more quicker or have additional resources. And there's interesting challenges that come with this. So I believe that this combination of both public and private policy relationships are going to be key to this. So I'll give you an example. If we think about where you would want to decarbonize from, one way that we can think about decarbonization with energy through new kinds of energy transmission is you could say, well, that resides with the energy provider. And in many places that is, government regulated and some kind of public concern across there. But if you put decarbonization aside, it will happen because it's comes out of the source, it's regulated, it's measured, and it will happen at the speed that things happen across there. But it will happen. If you put decarbonization, for instance, though, at the private company level, they might be more innovative, right? You could take a Tesla or a Nextera, and they might have some very brilliant ideas that say, we have the investments and we can go ahead and actually, drive more innovation and cause change to happen quicker. But the challenge would be they will now have access to the types of information that traditionally private companies haven't had. Around whether it's individuals or cities or, government level across there. So it will be a combination of the two. The good thing is that there's a model out there. We look at SpaceX, right? If we think about space flight, up until 10 years ago, we assumed, entirely as a society that large programs like space flight could only happen at the government and military level in order for these programs to take place and actually be funded and achieved. Once it became into the private market, we quickly saw the next generation of ideas and the expansion of not just technology, but also how spaceflight is perceived and where the commercial capabilities are. And now we're seeing governments working with these private institutions to accelerate their own programs because that's where the funding will take place and it just tries to drive that economy. I believe we'll see the same thing with sustainability coming across there. It will be a combination of those two. And that's how I think we'll get to the 7 years.
Hallelujah. Let's hope that will happen. And I hope that there will be many Elon Musks and billions of dollars and investors who support such thinking to accelerate that. I would like to go back to what you said, Corey, before in terms of the conservative industry that relates to smart spaces or construction or buildings in general. And according to a study, I remember reading a couple of years ago, a study by McKinsey, they put the construction industry right before agriculture, which was the last in terms of the most conservative industry there is in terms of transformation and willingness to adapt to new changes, which of course, makes your contribution even more important, given the fact that climate is changing, and we see it right now, the fires in Colorado and across the United States, across the world, actually, and also the floods in Germany, and the need to reconstruct using sustainable materials, whatever that means, but in a smarter way. So I would like to take a few minutes and really go deeper into this particular industry of smart spaces. What would be the look and the transformation of smart cities entail in terms of, what is the process, process that we'll have to undertake in order to get there. And very close associated with that, as an investor, I can tell many, many, many stories as to how difficult it is to invest in such transformative industries like energy and buildings, and have to fight the regulator, the governments, who are slow in adapting and adopting transformation, new regulation to support that transformation.
No, absolutely. And it's probably, and it's not just an issue that we're facing in our time, but you could roll this back to Rome, 1,500 years ago, about putting public fountains in place so that there's clean water right through here, or building roads coming across here with the infrastructure. So I think cities have always represented, our centers of commerce and population. I think 94% of us live what we would deem as a city. And it's important to understand, the shift of what's happening. Coming off of the pioneering sitting program that I've been on with the WEF, we took a long view of 26 cities, saying, where's the population shifts happening and what will be the size of cities? And the fact is that you can't just build fresh, right? Some areas you can, but ultimately you're doing a lot of, reconstruction or, reestablishment of existing, infrastructures. I think that traditionally, why they are a laggard in technology is that we've known how to make buildings for thousands of years, and even how our modern construction is still, other than moving to maybe CAD and other things, how we think about buildings and material sciences, it's not a lot different from how we contract those. For instance, there are building owners, there are construction managers, there are the suppliers across there, there's the civic engineers, and these are all very difficult jobs, and they do them well. Right, we are good at building buildings, and therefore it makes it harder to change why we would do things differently through here. And the margins to create buildings and the understanding of the economics of keeping those buildings viable, what purpose do they serve? How do we keep tenants in there? How do they provide health and services and safety across there? They're very slim margins as we make investments. A lot of buildings were challenged during COVID again to say, well, I have to put cameras in now, and I have to be able to look at data, and I have to have new security components through here. And it's just the reality of the world we live in right now. As a matter of fact, when we did the New York project, some of the statistics were that for the lack of tenants coming in, it takes up to 3 years to recover that economically if you're the building owner, right, through here. So the margins are slim, but they realize that in order for those assets to be relevant, they have to provide better services. They have to be able to provide for more. So going back to your original question of why haven't things changed as quickly, if you think of the amount of players that have the built environment, the shell and core designers, the actual construction components, the actual material suppliers, and then the operations themselves, they all have data. They all have different systems at this point of how they take this data. Often if they're doing a retrofit, the data that they thought they understood about a building isn't exactly matching up to what they had. So they will look at this and they'll say, I thought this pipe or conduit was here, or I thought this energy conduit was here, and now I've got 5G coming in. How am I going to do these things? So they want to future-proof. If they're going to do these upgrades and make the investment, they're saying, well, if I put this building in now, and I know that a building is minimally going to last 50 to 100 years in many cases, how can I future-proof. So maybe I'll put in 5 times as much conduit as I possibly think I'm going to need. It's because I don't want to have to go back and do this. And technology is just changing very, very, very quickly across there. But I think the pressure which has happened now is the fact that the users of the building and the actual people who've created the building, the technologies that they use in their daily lives or what they do with their suppliers is much more advanced than what they're putting in their buildings themselves. And I think they're realizing now that once those buildings can start being the next forefront of where technology takes place, the IoT world, the artificial intelligence world, it will be this huge network. It will be the largest network. And there's great economic opportunity for businesses and companies and for society. And there's also a challenge. I always picture in my mind that, I'll go back to the smartphone analogy. We use these phones and it's just become, more powerful than any computer we would have had 20 or 30 years ago through here. Now imagine living inside of that. This is what happens when you're in a building now, that the building environment is around you and how we interact. So I don't think we know what that means yet, and therefore it's hard. I think the other aspect, what we talk about in the book, is you used to say the most important first person in coming to design a building or a city, whether it was a civic engineer, was an architect, right? An architect would say, this is what the building means, this is how I build it safely, this is what it represents across there. They are still very, very important, but probably the most important person now is the technologist. Right. So how does technology play across there? How does material science come across? So I think it's absolutely imperative to understand, how those are now going to work together through here. And I think that the other aspect I was talking about is as we rethink our cities and as we look at where the shifts of population, not just in, say, the known built environments, but where cities in India or where cities in Africa will be taking place, or how we rethink of Europe as things move across here with the Union. I believe that populations will shift again. Cities will still remain to be the center of it, but the buildings themselves have to deliver a much bigger promise. And it's going to be a challenge for these companies to make the transition of what does technology mean to them? How do they build intelligent systems that will speak with other systems across there, not just buildings themselves, but all of the other aspects of technology that we have through here. And there are great examples of where this is taking place. It's always interesting when I look at stretch, areas. We look at stadiums, we look at airports, we look at large areas that say economically it's feasible to have, where we have large ingress and egress of populations, where there's entertainment taking place, or large events, or higher safety needs across there. So we know we can build these facilities. We can build a space station, right? Which is a very smart thing. We can build a submarine, which is a very smart thing. How do we apply that same level of thought into our buildings across there? That's where I think we can go.
Right. And the other question was, how do we get the government to go along with what is the right thing to do within this context, which is the experience that I had in a very negative way, because the government doesn't understand and is slow in changing. So that's a very important aspect of this, particular since you talked earlier before private-public partnerships, which are, of course, important in order to aggregate more capital and leverage what the government is willing to give. The rest has to come from private investors like I am. But how can we do this if the government doesn't get? And that's true from my experience in the Western world across the board. So
can I mention a couple of points?
Yeah, please.
Absolutely.
Here. In our research, working with academic institutions, particularly Arizona State University, which I just give a public shout out for further innovative thinking as well as action. And it's not just a public-private, like private and government, it's also the academic as the third leg of the stool. And where they're practical and they're engaged, there's a lot of progress that we've seen happen because they're in a unique position to push things forward in a way that isn't quite so commercially driven. And yet they're also not quite as, I'll say slow, but differently motivated like the government. So I think that the tri-party approach we've seen work well. The other is these leagues of cities when we've worked with the Silicon Valleys or the others, there are some of those city governments that are pretty advanced, and then how they're thinking and pulling in. And there are others that might not be in these centers that are still part of these organizations, and they're looking for guidance. So whether it comes from a book like ours, or they're being part of those leading, avant-garde, or pioneering small cities, we see that network effect. And remember, let's not forget, every day, part of the population's getting older. There's a new part of the population coming in who's working, consuming or prosuming, leading, making decisions, investing. And we've seen a shift with that. Like Corey said, where they're choosing to work, where they're choosing to purchase their goods, where they're choosing to live, what they're insisting as a citizen. So we are seeing that change. In some cases, I think that's accelerating, not just changing, but accelerating. And remember, we're sharing information so much now through the web, through internet, through being connected, and we have so much more data. Those digital or the exponential technologies, I think, are also hitting an inflection point. And that's why, if we focus attention in a practical way, not preaching or lecturing, but in a practical way that does not ignore behavioral science, I think we're in a much better place to make these things reality.
What I'd like to add to this, thoughts around the governments is, if we think about what motivates governments to act or not act as much across here, it's really about economics and tax base, like across there, and it's where populations reside. So I think, depending on what kind of government structure, whether it's a democracy or whether it's a social, model or some hybrid in between there's certain levels of understanding of what services will be provided and how the government will serve, that population. But regardless of those systems, it really does come down to, can I have economies that are robust, that provide jobs, that, make life longer for individuals, increase the level of productivity, and that will attract people to cities and to create economic centers across there. And I think one of the mechanisms that we've seen, recently, particularly heavily in Europe at this point, US is a little bit different. We can talk about that too. Is when the European Union announced the $500 billion fund, right, to say this is going to help towards sustainability. That suddenly became huge around the ESG investors, to say, who will get that investment and how will that credit take place and how will those investments come across there. And it became a competition. We're seeing it right now. We see things in the Nordic countries saying, well, the Nordics really wants to lead Europe in what's going on. And we also have Germany saying, we really want to be a leader. And the UK is kind of on its own saying, well, we really want to be the banking systems through here. And although there's regulatory components to the whole thing, it's kind of left up to these individual cities to even go beyond maybe what the government wants to say to do, to say, if you can make this work or if you can become that leader, we'll all benefit from that. So I think the government's trying to say, we will do what we can to help. We have to make sure that things are still providing the services across there so that we can continue to survive as an entity, as a country, for the common good. But if cities within a country can take a leading role of investment or come up with those plans, they'll support it, right? So that competition, I think, is
Corey, you left out the most important thing, because this is a branding aspect as well. Talk about what Pittsburgh's doing and what they've done to transform.
Right. So I reside in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which, if historically, if you live outside the city and you say, well, it's a steel city. It hasn't been a steel city for 30 something years. But at one time, it was, economically producing 80+% of the steel around the world, for close to 100 years through here. So very good economy, not great health-wise, but people had jobs, and it was one of the largest communities of corporate, leadership through here. I think it was only behind New York and Chicago in its heyday from corporate headquarters. But over the last 30 years, it made that transition. It had to, because the industry economics changed at a global level. So it was a long plan, but basically the city converted over to looking at technology from a biotech and robotics, because it was something we were very good at because of Carnegie Mellon University and Pitt and other aspects that we had and legacy of doing all of this steel work. And the other was with biotech. We had a huge health infrastructure component. So the city was able to build an economy based off of that, which became very robust and healthy. And at the same time, we had some real far-running thinkers around sustainability, because we had such a massive problem around pollution that the government invested a lot of money, and there was a lot of research done here. So particularly, I always talk about Rachel Carson as being one of the heroes here. So back in the 60s, she did something very controversial. She said, these chemicals and what we're doing is really impacting the environment and we need to change. And that was at the time when steel was in its heyday. And that was a direct challenge to the corporations here. And that doesn't make sense. That's going to take our economy down. We measure by economy. But now it's being recognized that, what she is saying is that the technologies that we have are capable of actually determining our destiny. So, Pittsburgh is now one of the greener cities on the planet, and they continue to innovate here. One of the things, two programs that are very interesting that are taking place right now is we've become a dark city, which basically said we were going to reduce our light that happens at night that's emitted from the city by 80%. We're going to use technology. We're not going to worry about the safety of the city won't decline. The visibility of the city and how you can use services won't be there. Will still be good, but we're not going to use that power and we're not going to pollute the sky with this. And a lot of cities around the world are looking and saying, what does a dark sky city mean? The other thing that's very interesting is that we've just set up a transportation system that is 100% off renewable energy. But more important, it is a link that says the transit systems, whether they're the trains, whether they're the buses, whether they're the scooters, the bicycles. We have trams that run up and down these hillsides here, which are pretty unique. They are not just all running off renewable, but they're all now connected as a single ticket. So I can take any one of these across there and have a complete transit experience of mobility that is 100% sustainable right now, that's easy to use, and we're learning. We have scooters still left on the street corners, and we're trying to figure out how those work. The trains run well, the inclines still work well, but the majority of the city is doing that. The other thing that we are also doing by mandate is it'll probably pass within a couple of weeks, is that we'll become plastic free. It's another decision that the city has made. So it's kind of those micro changes. Although they might sound like micro changes, doesn't mean the whole government of the United States has to do this, but as a city level, those are things that we are opting to do as a society.
Wow, and that's very inspirational. And I think, yes, all cities should start going in this direction. So it's been a wonderful interview. Any other three most important thoughts that you would like to leave our listeners with, both of you?
You first, Corey.
Yeah, certainly. So I think that the timing of why this book take place. I said earlier about this book was just necessary as part of the process to be part of the solution, right? It's part of the journey through here. It really is the fact that sustainability is our biggest challenge out there right now, and it will be for the next 50 years, if not beyond, right? But economically, at least for the next 50 years, it has to be addressed. Secondly, is the technology is available now to have a very practical major impact through here. And also that the cultural readiness is there. If our governments aren't ready, the populations are. And maybe that will challenge some of the governments here. So, the inspiration, for us, at least for myself personally, and I'll let Jeff give his own thoughts on this, is what can I do now personally that will have the largest amount of impact? And, my goal is that not just to have businesses and leaders look at this, but what is that generation of individuals that are in colleges right now and even at the high school level, be able to say, I can have not just a career here, but this is what I want to do with my life. This is something where I can actually have control over this and not just say, well, this is the way things are, because they have a high interest in doing this. I think they have the intelligence for coming across here. And it's not it's not a technology wave. It's just like there's the information age, now it's the sustainability age. And whether governments or businesses are ready for it, society is ready for it. And this generation will be doing this. So that was the big inspiration for myself.
Jeff?
Logos, ethos, and pathos, head, hands, and heart. We've got the science, we've got the purpose, and we have, I think, the will and the action to do this. And there's an old saying that you cannot stop an idea whose time has come. And I think that's the point. Not only is the idea, but I think the means to do it. And it also can capture both aspirational. It isn't just a compliance drudgery thing. There's an aspirational part where there's less of negotiation. I'm not against the other side of the desk from you, Mariana, as we discussed this. We're on the same side of the desk staring at the problem, the wicked challenge. And you don't have that a lot. Often things are seen as a zero-sum game. And finally, those words that you often like to use, within planetary boundaries, knowing these constraints, knowing this is bigger, whether it's the clock ticking. Because of that, there's a sense of urgency, not desperation, but urgency that what we do matters, how we spend our time matters, how we spend our resources matter. And I think I think I can speak for Corey here, it keeps us not just up at night, but more importantly, gets us up in the morning. And the only thing I'll say about our company is I do feel fortunate, very fortunate, to be at a company at this point that has these similar ideas. So the ability to project our influence or to make some impact is bigger because of that. And I want to make the most of this precious opportunity. And again, thank you for having us on so we can share that. And if you don't get the practical sustainability from the results of our research, get it from somewhere. It's an important topic that needs to be addressed.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so very much for your time and effort. And I wish you good luck with your book, and keep being inspirational and inspired. I would love to be in touch. And also, where can people go and find more information about your work?
Well, since we led with the book and the research, you can go to infosys.com/practical sustainability, the book, or I'm sorry, practical sustainability book, or you could literally just type in the words, because it's become enough of a movement now that just the words and you get to it. It's available February 1st, and on all major platforms. And more importantly than that, there's an ongoing release of research. So go to the Infosys Knowledge Institute, to just type that in, find us. And we have a regular source or microsites. This information is free. We're sharing it. And of course, there are a variety of panels and forums where we're sharing this. It's ongoing. And most importantly, it's not the Jeff and Corey show, nor is it just about Infosys. This is a collection, a collaboration. We work with the UN, as Corey mentioned, closely with the World Economic Forum. We presented in these capacities at Davos, and a variety of large and small organizations and academic institutions. We just like to be a messenger and a curator and hopefully make an impact and keep the dialogue going, because quite often the challenge is not that it doesn't happen, it's that people aren't aware of it and can't access it, and we want to change that. And of course, you can find us, on LinkedIn or Twitter as well. Just look up our names.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, and good luck to all of us.